We must admit that we mere humans are not clairvoyant. This is why the prudent leader carefully studies history. The best predictor of the future, apart from a divinely inspired prophet, is history. Therefore, successful leaders have always based their strategies for the future on a careful study of the past. We see this demonstrated every day in the business world. A business owner or corporate buyer bases his orders for the future on the record of past sales and profits. How much should we order for this season? Let's study the sales record for previous seasons. But when planning the defense of a country, knowing the history of a possible threat's motivations and actions is absolutely imperative. Those entrusted with defending the country must learn as much as possible about the strategies and tactics of potential enemies in order to ensure our security. For an elected official to play politics with the most solemn trust is tantamount to treason. The number one responsibility of the President and Congress is to ensure our defense against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In fact, this is a critical part of the oath each one swears to. It's for this reason that I make the following observations from well-proven current history. This report is based on Dr. Peter Hammond's book, Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, The Historical Roots and Contemporary Threat. The book is based on the documented history of the actions taken by Muslims who have immigrated to Western countries. First, it's imperative to understand that Islam is not just a religion. It's a complete, total system of life. Islam deals with the religious, social, legal, political, economic, and military facets of Muslim life. It is designed to control all aspects of a believer's life. This is why a Muslim feels estranged from his religion when he migrates to a different culture, especially in the West. He feels that he must change that culture to fit the Quran as soon as possible. This process, known as Islamization, begins when there are sufficient numbers of Muslims in a country to agitate for their religious privileges. When Western, politically correct, tolerant, and culturally diverse societies agree to Muslim demands for religious privileges, all the other components begin to creep in as well. This is the goal of all Islam as spelled out in the Quran, to subject all societies to the Muslim laws and way of life. Historically, here's how it works. As long as the Muslim population remains under 2% in any given country, it will be, for the most part, regarded as a peace-loving minority, not as a threat to other citizens. We see this as the case in, among other nations, the United States, where Muslims comprise 0.6% of the population, Australia and Italy, 1.5%, China and Norway, 1.8%, and Canada, 1.9%. At around 2 to 5% of the population, they begin to proselytize from other ethnic minorities and disaffected groups. Often much of their success derives from major recruiting in jails and prisons and among street gangs. This is currently happening in countries like Denmark, where Muslims comprise 2% of the population, the United Kingdom at 2.7%, Germany at 3.7%, and Spain at 4%. Once Muslims comprise at least 5% of a nation's total population, they exercise an influence disproportionate to their actual numbers. For example, they will push for the introduction of halal food. This term describes food considered clean by Islamic standards. They will increase pressure on supermarket chains to feature halal on their shelves. Failure to comply brings threats of violence. This very thing is occurring in countries like France, which is now 8% Muslim, or Switzerland, the Philippines, and Sweden at 5%, and the Netherlands, which is now 5.5% Muslim. But you may be saying, what about Jews and their requirements for kosher food? Have you ever seen threats of violence used to force stores or food service establishments to stock kosher food? Kosher foods and other ethnic or religion-specific foods are available because of popular demand, not legislation or threats. At this point, the Islamic minority will begin to work to persuade the ruling government to allow them to rule themselves within their neighborhoods under Sharia, the Islamic law. Remember, the publicly declared and ultimate goal of Islamists is the establishment of Sharia law with its underlying culture over the entire world. When the Muslim minority approaches 10% of the population, they begin to utilize violent demonstrations as a means of securing their demands. Paris, France has already seen car burnings and other aggressive outbreaks. Any action that is perceived offensive to Islam results in violent uprisings, including threats to the lives of individuals and public figures, such as in Amsterdam. Their political cartoons and documentary films about Muhammad have been declared an offense to Islam. However, such tensions and outbursts as these are seen daily, particularly in Muslim sections of Ghana and Kenya, India, Russia, and Israel, where Muslims comprise 16% of the population. After Muslims reach a 20% share, nations can expect hair-trigger rioting, jihad militia formations, sporadic killings, and burnings of Christian churches and Jewish synagogues, such as in Ethiopia, where almost 33% of the population is Muslim. At 40%, nations may experience widespread massacres, chronic terror attacks, and ongoing militia warfare such as we've witnessed in Bosnia, Chad, and Lebanon. From 60%, nations experience unfettered persecution of infidels or non-believers of all other religions, including non-conforming Muslims, and sporadic ethnic cleansing or genocide with the use of Sharia law as a weapon, and jizya, which is the tax forced on infidels. In the last 2 decades, we've seen all of these characteristic actions take place in places like Malaysia, Albania, Qatar, and especially the Sudan. Then, with a Muslim population of at least 80%, a nation's citizens can expect daily intimidation and violent jihad, some state-run ethnic cleansing, and even genocide as these nations drive out the infidels and move toward the goal of being 100% Muslim. Some or all of these characteristics have made the news in places like Egypt, Gaza, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Morocco, Pakistan, Syria, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. But what happens when a nation reaches the goal of 100% Muslim? That will usher in Dar al-Salam, which means the house of peace. At least that's the promise. Here there's supposed to be peace because everybody is a Muslim. The madrasas are the only schools, and the Quran spells out the only acceptable way of life. That's the expectation promised by the Quran. What then is the reality in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, and Yemen, all of which are 100% Muslim? Historically, this promised peace has not been realized. And in these states, it's the most radical Muslims who rise to rule over the more tolerant and peaceful Muslims. Those who claim they are the most devout and pure followers of Allah inflict intimidation and violence on their fellow Muslims. One of the most obvious examples is the Taliban in Afghanistan with their public killings and beatings, especially women. It's also important to understand that in some countries with relatively small Muslim populations, such as France, Muslims live in ghettos. These ghettos have a 100% Muslim population that live under Sharia law. In such situations, Muslims do not integrate with the host population. Their children attend madrasas. They learn only the Quran. To even associate with an infidel is a crime that could be punishable with death. Therefore, in these areas, Muslim imams and extremists exercise much more power than the national percentage would merit, and they pose a much greater danger. Today's 1.5 billion Muslims make up 22% of the world's population. but their birth rate dwarfs the birth rates of Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, and all other religions. At their current birth rate, Muslims will exceed 50% of the world's population by the end of this century. These are the historical facts. I'm only trying to tell the truth. For Western nations to ignore them is a fatal mistake. For our leaders to ignore them is a total failure to do the job they were elected to do. I'll have more in a moment.